Okay, now the next session, once again, the second panel is Embracing Adaptation, Building a Brighter Startup Ecosystem. This session is powered by Cradle and My Startup. The moderator is Aaron Sarma, the general partner of Scale Up Malaysia, and joining him on stage are Ahmad Kashfi, Senior Vice President of Ecosystem Development, Cradle Fund, Afan Koo, founder and CEO of kakitangan.com, and Carl Liu, founder and CEO of Service Heroes. Gentlemen, can I have you on stage, please? Now, before we start the session, right, let me just give you a short intro to what this session is going to be about. Startups generally lack the structured support, resources, and programs that keeps them going. Now, close to home, right, Malaysia has its fair share of, startup challenges. I'm pretty sure a lot of you know what are those challenges. So for startup owners here, this session is for you. So let's hear from our industry experts as they discuss key factors impacting the startup scene. Over to you, Aaron.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's so good to see humans again. Isn't it nice? I mean, I've been seeing people in screens all this while. Nice to see people again. And so I'm with some friends. We're going to talk about the ecosystem. And we told each other before we came on, we're going to try to pretend this is a mamak stall. So we'll try to be as candid as we can, as open as we can, and try to keep this as interesting as we are here. My name is Aaron Sama. I'm the general partner of Scale Up Malaysia. I've got a great panel with me. I've got Kalu, he's the co-founder and CEO of Service Hero. We've got Afan Koo, he's the co-founder and CEO of kakitangan.com. And Ahmad Kashfi, he's the VP of Ecosystem Development at Cradle Fund. So we've talked about how the ecosystem has changed over the years, right? And we've seen lots of intervention from the government, doing different programs. We heard from the great panel earlier about the perspective from the government standpoint, right? And yet, over the last few years, despite all this support, a lot of the concern is that, is Malaysia moving fast enough? Are we competitive with our regional counterparts? And so these are some of the things that we're going to discuss this morning. I thought we'll start, guys, by let's talk about the state of play. Where are we today? And from the perspective of founders and people working in the ecosystem, what is your perspective? So Carl, let's start with you. Service Hero has been a leading startup in the Malaysian ecosystem for several years. You've expanded to markets all over Southeast Asia. You also raised capital from Cradle Seed Ventures, as well as Golden Gate Ventures, who is also here today. But what do you think the perception has been from international investors on the Malaysian ecosystem? Do international investors see Malaysia as inherently investable?
Yeah, no. I think from the international investor perspective, they see Malaysia as having a lot of upside potential, a lot of opportunity for digitization of work, of the way that we live our lives. So in that respect, I think internationally people are excited about Malaysia. In terms of the founders and the startups coming out of the region, I think in the last panel they mentioned that Malaysians have a very good reputation regionally, whether or not they're based here or in other countries. And their reputation is well known as being able to build organizations and scale them regionally. I think a critical word that I just mentioned is scaling, right? And I think we're at the stage of the startup life cycle where many companies were established about 5 years ago, right? I think that was really a heyday where a lot of new kind of startups were coming up into the scene. And what they require now is capital to scale out. We've had tremendous success kind of starting out companies. A lot of founders receive their seed or Series A. And now is the time for them to raise their Series Bs and Cs, right? So one thing I think that the environment needs is clearer kind of access to that kind of scale-up funding.
I mean, it's interesting you say that, right? Because, like F1, you and I, we started our startups around the same time, right? And you're right. I do see that 2015, 2016 period as kind of like almost a gold rush of the startup space. We saw lots of companies get funded. What do you think the gap is? Why have we had a difficult time for a lot of these companies to raise follow-on capital? What do you think, Carl?
I think a lot of it has to do with storytelling, right? This is a
we heard that just now as
theme,
well, yeah.
right? That was communicated just in the last panel. Startups in Malaysia generally aren't great at storytelling, which makes it difficult for them to position and sell themselves on these kind of bigger, broader kind of visions. So I think that's limited a lot of startups from raising that kind of scaling up larger kind of check sizes.
So let's talk about startups itself and the founders. So Evan, you have an interesting journey as Kaki Tangan, right? You were one of the very first startups in Malaysia to raise successfully on pitch-in, right? Was it in 24 hours or something like that?
Yeah,
Yeah, it was.
that's right.
And then you've also got investments from OSK Ventures as well as BFM Capital. So how have Malaysian founders evolved, right? So we've done so many intervention programs. Have our founders become better, or are they more complacent?
I think for sure, throughout the years, the ecosystem getting stronger, the support's getting better, the founders are getting stronger as well. And in fact, last 2 years, pandemics happens. It doesn't change all the things, but it changed a lot of things, right? We have been, from Kaki Tangan, we have been seeing thousands of companies. Every day we eat, sleep, breath with them, or not only digital startup, but all the SMEs. Some of them are feeling sad, right? So they said, geez, it's getting lesser and less sustainable anymore, right? And some of them, you actually pivoted and say, let's do something new again. I think in general, things are getting better because whatever situation, if they are feeling stressful today, they must be thinking of pivoting. And when they change, they actually pivot the company or businesses to be stronger and more adaptive to the future economies.
So would you say?
So I'm optimist.
Would you say that entrepreneurs now are more resilient than they were a couple of years ago?
They are more resilient. Well, when you pass through a difficult journey, you always are more resilient. In fact, also the mindset change. So it's like go from I care nothing about it, I just fall in love with my idea, but falling back to let's try to figure out how do we really scale it up, right? And a lot of people put more thinking about it. So I kind of agree with Carl that we have more people today that's moving from infancy stage to real go-go stage in the company life cycle.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit about the maturity, both of the ecosystem and the maturity of the founders that we have as well, right? So whereas I think, Aaron, you're saying 5-6 years ago, that kind of golden goal rush where a lot of startups came to market with big, bold, ambitious ideas. Today, I think we're seeing that those who are still around have been very adaptable. The founders have got a lot more mature about paths to profitability. And that's where I think we are at within the kind of life cycles of the startup community in Malaysia.
Excellent. I mean, I think that sets the stage really well for the question I'm going to ask Cash, right? So you're in trouble.
Yeah. So I'm going to throw a spanner into that.
So Cradle Fund kind of has, you've launched My Startup, right? I think, just out of curiosity, anybody in the room know what My Startup is? The guys who work at Cradle not counted, okay?
Great.
Yeah, well, if you saw any Cradle guys who did not raise their hands, you can ask them questions later. Sure. So, first of all, you've identified 5 critical challenges in the startup ecosystem. You've launched a roadmap called SUPER. So, guys, if you're counting, that's 2 acronyms. And maybe you can explain what those are, right? And what do you see, especially based on what the 2 guys have said, is the state of play here in Malaysia?
Hi. So here's the question, right? With what we've seen, what we've experienced so far, that entrepreneurs are more resilient these days, there are a lot of opportunities out there, then why are we still behind, right? Why? So here's the thing. Let's look at it from an economics perspective. A couple of days ago, according to the economists, our GDP growth is about 8.9%, right? Which essentially surpassed analysts' expectations of 5%. Our internet penetration here in Malaysia is about 90%. Smartphone penetration is also about the same, 90%. And then we've heard from the panelists, from our panelists before, that the digital economy is set to grow to 25.5, 26% by 2025. And then there's another report by McKinsey, if I remember correctly, that due to the pandemic, it has accelerated the growth, or rather the adoption of digital services by 4 times, or rather 4 years, sorry, not 4 times, 4 years ahead of its time here in Southeast Asia, right? So, you know, where's the opportunity right there? Well, we do know that if you look at the numbers again, that there are new problems to be solved, right? The proliferation of the internet with the launch of 5G, that essentially will accelerate innovation. But then again, the way I see it, and also based on the startup ecosystem roadmap that we've launched last year, I didn't write the roadmap, of course. I mean, it was a collective effort with other agencies and other stakeholders in the startup ecosystem to find out what are the main pain points that are faced by startup founders these days. And we've identified 5. First being lack of private sector participation in the startup ecosystem. And I know it's really difficult if, you know, if almost 15 odd years being in the corporate sector has taught me that working with startups is like, well, the analogy is like an elephant trying to dance with a mouse, right? So the elephant has to be careful not to trample on the mouse and so on and so forth, right? Secondly, lack of talent. I mean, of course, you know, we've lost talent to all of the giants, software companies, not enough talent to build stuff within the ecosystem. Thirdly, there's no clear path from ideation to commercialization. I have my idea, then what? How do I go to market, right? Fourthly, systemic issues, of course. Our current policies and regulations are not conducive for startups to thrive, for startups to grow here in Malaysia. And last but not least, there's not enough go-to-market channels for startups to grow. Because we strongly believe, from our perspective, that in order for us to scale and to become global leaders, we can't just be focusing on Malaysia, right? We need to have that Southeast Asia strategy from the get-go. So that's the collective wisdom as to, you know, why we launched My Startup as an initiative.
So what does My Startup do exactly? Like,
Okay.
How does it work, and what does it hope to achieve?
Okay. Numbers again. 57% of unicorns in the world are not founded in the US. 50% of those unicorn founders are not born and bred in the US. So we know that there's hope for us in this market, and especially Malaysia, right? But then again, it's not easy. We know that. 90% of startups fail. In fact, the success rate of launching rockets into space is at 94%, right? What does it tell you? I mean, I'm not saying that, you know, launching rockets into space is an easy feat. Of course not, right? But then again, we can all agree that building companies is really, really hard. And I know this because, you know, I used to have my own failed internet venture as well in 2008. So we thought, for My Startup, we looked at each stage of the startup life cycle, starting from ideation to growth. And we believe, although we are still testing that concept, that idea, that if we offer or craft bespoke programs at each stage of the startup life cycle, we will give them a fair chance, right, for them to, you know, develop the business model, to grow, to fundraise, and so on and so forth, right? So My Startup consists of several components. I'm not going to go into detail, but generally it consists of, you know, ideation-based programs, capacity-building programs, a pre-accelerator program, an accelerator program. And also, I remember that Sharil Hamdan mentioned earlier that, you know, it would be great if we can have our own version of Crunchbase here in Malaysia. So that is what we're trying to address, that need in the market by having this portal called mystartup.gov.my. Early days, of course, but then again, you know, we will still continue building on that proposition. Yeah.
Okay. One last question before we move on to the next part of the discussion, right? So what do you think, based on this new initiative called My Startup, what do you hope to achieve in the market?
That's a good question. Now, according to this book, right, From Good to Great by Jim Collins, right? So what differs, good companies with great companies is that they have that economic flywheel. So essentially what we're building is not just running events, right, or signing MOUs, right? But essentially what we're trying to build is not just an ecosystem, but an economic flywheel for startups to thrive, right? Like Carl and Efon to be part of the ecosystem or the economic flywheel as well. Because we also believe that if we carry on with the momentum and learn from our experience, we will generate enough centrifugal force, right, for the economic flywheel to gain momentum and also propel our ecosystem globally, right? We aspire, I know this is crazy, but we aspire to be one of the top 20 global startup ecosystems by 2030. Crazy, right?
So, when people say we want to be one of the top something of something, right? I sometimes struggle to wonder what that means exactly, right? So, obviously we assume that...
Patrick actually mentioned Silicon Valley.
Yeah, Patrick said number one, right? But what does it mean to be in the top 20? Because right now, where are we now?
Right.
And maybe before we go back to you, I'll let the other guys talk, right? So if we want to kind of build an ecosystem that is, I guess, maybe called globally renowned or known as a top ecosystem, what do you guys think that looks like?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When Ash was speaking and talking about the government initiatives that Cradle is doing and my startup is doing, I started to think, there seems to be a lot of focus in Malaysia for government intervention, a lot of government departments that are tasked with having to build up ecosystem, provide funding, be the connector. And I think that's quite unique to Malaysia. And I think, while digital is a kind of important opportunity to invite the private sector, large organizations, multinationals to get involved in Malaysia with actually being part of that ecosystem development. So Servicera operates both in Malaysia as well as Singapore and Thailand. And it's very interesting to see the different approaches that all the countries have when it comes to ecosystem development. Whereas we have departments like Cradle, Meranti, MDEC that are heavily involved with nurturing the startup ecosystem. Places like Thailand, you see the private sector, large organizations getting involved, right? In Singapore, you've got both the local and international companies setting up accelerators or innovation centers that actually play a part that is quite similar to what my startup is trying to achieve. I think recently came across, I think, 2 organizations doing this very well. So in Thailand, I saw PTTOR, the oil and gas company, set up a fund with 500 startups. Horizon Ventures, and creating a path to commercialization for a lot of companies that they had invested in. If we look at some multinationals in Singapore, not just local ones, international brands like Schneider Electric, who have an internal team that will consult within their internal departments and introduce them to external startups to cooperate with, right? So I think what we would welcome in Malaysia in the startup community is that there's not just the government or government agencies that are taking a leading role in ecosystem development, but it's also large private sector organizations as well.
It's kind of interesting, So for a period, I did some consulting work with a government agency here, right? And we went to Jakarta to go and meet the ecosystem there. We had some meetings, wanted to understand how the Indonesian startup scene worked and maybe forge some collaboration of some sort, right? And at dinner with one of these startups, right? There's like a Series B startup. And casually, I just asked him, hey, so how does your government help you? How, do you have an agency or whatever? And he was like, honestly, Aaron, you're the first government agency guy I've ever met. And I was like, whoa, is that really the case? That, maybe is it the case that in Malaysia, are we overly dependent on government intervention to get things done? Efon, I just want to ask you, do you think too many programs makes our founders complacent and not as aggressive as they need to be?
Well, program is just serving as a support to empower people to do works better, right? But actually, I would rather pull it back to the two top dying topics of the 5 initiatives we were talking about. One is actually involvement of the private sector. Another one is digital talent. Talking about the involvement of the private sector, I can't help to imagine what if, for example, there are government's property developer acquiring or investing PropTech. What if Tenaga National actually investing in the new energies? What if the banks, telcos, do more investment or acquisitions? What you do is plug in your product and talent into the big customer base that the corporate has, right? Yeah. So then actually it sparks the corporate long-term vision and business. On the other hand, it improved the innovation in the big, corporate situation. So I think that worth exploring more.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'll ask you a question after this, right? So I think it's interesting because we are where we are. The government has done a lot of things, but there have been successful points where there's been like a handover process, right? So the government starts something, and I believe that the government should do things where maybe the private sector doesn't want to do something that's space because maybe economics don't make sense or the commercials, are imbalanced or whatever, right? So then the government's the right prime mover to make something happen. So Cash, do you think there should be a process to hand over more activities to the private sector and maybe involve the private sector more in supporting startups?
Well, before I answer that question, so essentially let's take a step back, and we need to clarify our role in the entire scheme of things. We, as in government agencies, right? That essentially we are just facilitators, and we should just remain as facilitators, right? Not as mentors or business experts, trying to mentor startups or businesses. No. What we should do is basically focus on what we do best, is to make sure that we come up with the best policies for the startups to thrive, for startup founders to thrive, right? And to segue into corporate participation, we also quoting a book, Innovation Paradox, that this is what we've seen so far, that what makes a company or a corporate entity really good at is also their curse, because then they will be complacent and just maintain status quo, right? But then again, we can start to see the trend moving forward that corporates are starting to open up to work with startups and also community leads, because they know that if they don't innovate, they will be disrupted, right? I'm not going to go into the typical horror stories like Kodak and all that, because I think most of you know, right, what happened to them. But I think it's a good signal, and it's a good indication. In fact, for the My Startup initiative, we have Petronas as our marquee partner, and then we have Microsoft as well, and there are a few more in the pipeline. But the common theme that we got from our conversations with potential corporate partners and also our corporate partners is that we want to work with startups, we just don't know how, right? So therefore, we believe that if we keep on engaging with corporate partners and also have that open channel for them to speak to some of the startups that we're pre-accelerating and accelerating, I believe that something virtuous will come out of it, right? I mean, yeah, of course, we'll make some mistakes here and there. There's a lot of figuring out that needs to be done because we don't know what we don't know yet, right?
Talking about Microsoft, there was a precedent that Facebook actually acquired a Malaysian company before.
There you go. Right. Yeah. So that's essentially
more should be expected in the local, probably corporates, right?
Yeah, and I think private sector participation is important because it also facilitates things like investments and M&A activities and stuff like that. And I think that creates a situation where founders feel that running a startup could be a decent career opportunity for them, right? Where, hey, there's a path to exit. I don't have to be that 1 in a million, but I can actually find a partner or safe harbor with a corporate. Carl, what do you think of this? How do we like, stack up in this regard to our regional neighbors as far as we've seen?
Well, it's interesting. You know, we focus a lot on starting up, right? The startup kind of discussion is how do you start something up, but equally as important is that for a business to be venture-backed, there needs to be an exit story as well. And if we look to Malaysia, there are a couple of large organizations that provide that kind of exit. Large companies like AirAsia, I think, is, Aaron, I'm sure you're familiar, is quite active in this M&A space. And if we have those exit scenarios and they're well known, you're going to do a couple of things. One is that you're going to attract investment into the region, into the startup community. You're going to motivate founders to want to establish a company. And thirdly, is also to attract talent, I think, which is a common theme today, right? Is how do we retain, groom, and attract a talent in Malaysia? If the corporate sector is one way for us to provide more exit opportunities and to provide that kind of incentives, I think, yeah, that's great.
Actually, I spent 10 years in China before coming back to start Kakitang, and that's exactly what we saw from the era in China at that time. A lot of people are working hard because they've seen people been there, done that. Not necessarily to even be a founder, but also as, you know, a co-founder or even employees of a startup that been there, done that, got some cash out, and they see they are motivated. So we probably should actually have more cases here.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to switch gears a bit in the closing moments of this panel session, right? I thought we'd just touch a little bit about the talent component, since it keeps coming up, and just to get what your views are on this, right? So I'll ask the question to all three of you, right? Do you think that we lack talent in Malaysia, or are we losing talent to other markets? And if the latter is true, what can we do to prevent this from happening? And what else can we do to mitigate this challenge of talent? Maybe we'll start with Carl first, and then we'll go to Irfan and then Cash.
So I think today, more than ever, tech workers have a lot of options, right? They can be digital nomads and remote workers in Bali, right? They could work in any of the Southeast Asian countries because tech talent is high in demand. And from my experience running my company, we have a lot of staff that come up to me and ask, is there opportunities for relocation to another office, Singapore usually, right? And you've got to ask yourself, why is that? Apart from the earning potential being higher, the Singapore dollar obviously
is there like a subtle way to get like a pay raise to be transferred to Singapore?
No, I mean, that's certainly part of it. But I think another part of the kind of the reasons that we're losing talent is that places like Singapore are doing a really good job attracting global talent and global networks and opportunity. And it's kind of a virtuous cycle. So people kind of then look at Singapore as a place where they can get access to networks, to mentorship, not just a higher kind of pay grade, and access to kind of international brands, right? So yeah, to answer the question directly, yeah, we are. I think it's a real threat that we're losing talent.
What can we do to fix this?
I have a different opinion on the fixing. I think the only way to fix it is to build a bigger talent pool, not by varying them going off, not by talking about retention. Of course, retention is important, but a lot of them are market force and you can't do much. You should build a bigger talent pool. So number two, I actually see the talent pool in 3 different categories. They are senior digital talent, medium level, and the junior level. Senior digital talent you can hire anywhere, as long as you have the money, right? So junior, we always have pretty good junior talents. One ask I would normally hope the local education system can produce better mathematics standards, say 3 years in more advanced, right, comparing to today, right? That would continue to nurture not only the digital talent, but also business and many others, because if you look at Wall Street, it's all mathematic genius, right? So the medium level is the one we normally talking about lacking. In order to create big batch of a medium layer, you need two things. One thing is we need to fix our working visas, right? We were talking a lot just now already, right? So can we actually get a foreign digital working visa approved or rejected in 3 days to 5 days, business days, instead of months? That's number one. Number two, say we have local schools training the foreign students to be good engineers, and we intern them, we like them, then suddenly we realize that you're going to spend another 6 months in order to get their visa done. Can we auto-grant the work visa for the student graduating here? So this is the second thing. So that's the work visa part. The second part of the fix, I was kind of like learning from China, because in 30 years ago, it's quite similar to us. They have good batch of junior. Microsoft went in and hired a few thousand engineers, right? Senior they get from US. What happened is after a few years, the middle layer are built out. The middle layer are the one that does the work, process the HR policies, and maintain the entire engineering process, right? So then after this batch of people came out from Microsoft, they joined Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba. And after that, Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba nurtured, each of them nurtured out hundreds of startups. The rest is the history. We could do the same. I always say it's totally okay for companies that actually set up their holding in Singapore if they actually get money from Singapore. You can't stop it. But can we convince them to park their operation and engineer hub in Malaysia? Can we set up an office in Singapore just besides their investment town? Anyone get an investment, please come to Malaysia and build out your operation. Can we do that? You know, if we have 3 to 5 Grabs equivalent for that in Malaysia, in 5 to 10 years' time, the digital talent problem will be solved. Sorry, take a little bit of time.
So we've got like a couple minutes left, and I thought we'd just end on a bit of a forward-looking note, right? One thing I'll say, right, is that it takes like just how it takes a village to raise a child, it takes an ecosystem to raise a startup, and it takes all of us to kind of work together to make it better. And what I'm really excited about is how everybody on the panel has a very strong view and has a desire to kind of make things better for our entrepreneurs, our startups, and the overall ecosystem itself. So just like how we would talk to a startup, I want to think about the next 12 months. I mean, obviously, it's nice to have 5-year plans, but what is the next 12 months going to look like, right? And since Gash, you didn't get to answer the last question, I'll start with you, right? What do you think we can expect in the next 12 months, I guess, with the My Startup program? And what do you hope for will be the outcome of the next 12 months?
We will continue building for a better Malaysia. So, if I take a step back, if you all take a step back and look at it from an economics perspective, I think, you know, there's no question in terms of supply and also demand for talent, especially, and some of it has been covered by you guys. But I think we need to look at it from an incentive perspective, right? We need to fix those incentives and make sure that it is attractive enough to attract talent into our ecosystem. That's one. Number two is branding. I agree with what you said, that basically we're not good at telling our stories, right? So I think that needs to change, whereby, you know, we need to, double down on our efforts to tell the Malaysian story as a gateway to Southeast Asia, right? That this is where it starts, and you will end in, any market in Southeast Asia. So that needs to be done. 12 more months. We'll, of course, be working closely with founders, with other government agencies, with VCs, and also the academia as well, to also review, how we're doing, and to see what are new pain points, right? And then we will try to optimize our efforts and also solve that as well. Hopefully, right, we will double down on our current efforts. We will also focus on developing talents for developers, and also to tell that story to potential investors that, hey, we have a vibrant and thriving startup ecosystem here in Malaysia. Long and arduous road. It's not going to be easy, but of course, with all of you here. I mean, we can't do this alone. We need to work with smarter people like you guys, right, to tell this story together.
Great. I'm gonna, guys, you got 30 seconds each because we are really short on time. 30 seconds, what you hope to see in the next 12 months, F1 and Carl. Yeah.
So number one, of course, create more exits, for sure. Number two, the talents one, operational-wise, fix it. The work visas things, and we need to need a lot of government colleagues' help to educate internal colleagues that if you look at the cases that foreign talent come in and threaten the local job opportunities, it's not the long-term question. It's actually a short-term thing. Because short-term, it threaten you. But in long-term, it actually educate the local people to be stronger, and we actually creating a bigger talent pool. As long as we have a bigger talent pool in Malaysia, you still continue to have race fund in Singapore, built in Malaysia, and sell it into Indonesia story.
Okay, I gotta give time to Carl, and then we'll wrap up.
Very quickly, regional talent war is very real right now. A lot of our neighboring countries are getting very proactive about this, and so it's time for Malaysia to get very aggressive. Yeah.
Aggression. I like that. That's a great way to end. Thank you, everyone. Would you give them a hand? Cash, Carl, and Effen. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was insightful indeed. So, startups, from everything you've taken away from this session, I'm pretty sure you can build a brighter ecosystem for the startup community. I do understand that you guys are actually heading out to get coffee, but please head back in because we will have longer networking sessions later in the day. And in the meantime, do take this opportunity to listen into all the sessions that we are having.